I'm speaking with Sir Max Hastings, author of Vietnam, An Epic Tragedy, 1945 to 1975. Thank you for speaking with me.
My pleasure, my dear Chris. It's always a pleasure to talk to fellow military history buffs.
Thank you. So tell me first, I know a little bit about your history, obviously. You've been at this for a while. Can you tell me how you got around to studying and writing on this subject?
Well, I first went to Vietnam in 1970 as a very young 24-year-old reporter for BBC. And I did a string of short films there. And then I went back in 1971, 73, 74, and then finally I came out of Saigon in the final evacuation from the U.S. Embassy in 75. And then, although I started soon after that writing big books about military history, that I somehow didn't think I was going to be writing about Vietnam, but it had made a huge impression on me as a young man, as it did on all the grunts and Marines who fought there. But I somehow, it was such a messy, in many ways pretty miserable war, that I didn't see myself writing a book. But then I just got to the point where I started looking back on this whole experience, and I think I'd read most of the big books about the war, and I just felt there was so much to be said that hadn't been understood at the time, that we didn't understand at the time. But in those days, I mean, I got caught up in the general mood of what you saw in Saigon, and you were looking at this huge screw-up. You were looking at a war that obviously by 1970 wasn't going anyplace, and we allowed, I think, the coverage, the media at large, even far more experienced and wiser reporters than me, allowed our coverage to be overwhelmingly influenced by all the pretty awful things that we could see going around us every day. And one of the things, although I never thought, even when I first went there, that the United States could win the war, I always felt, and I felt this the day I flew out of the U.S. Embassy on April the 29th, 75, I never felt that the other side deserved to win. And the more we've learned since about the communist regime in the North, which of course they ruthlessly and brilliantly concealed from us all while the war was going on, and what I realized is that what you really had was two equally unpleasant totalitarian tyrannies in North and South Vietnam. But the North won the propaganda war. And in this extraordinary way, because I lived here in the United States in 67, 68, that we had all these kids out demonstrating Ho Chi Minh and having posters of Mao Zedong on their college walls. And nobody seemed to notice the fact that Mao Zedong was right up there with Hitler as one of the great mass murderers of the 20th century. And Ho Chi Minh was a ruthless revolutionary. That although everybody's seen the photographs of the naked kids screaming, running away after the napalm attack, the South Vietnamese police chief shooting dead a Viet Cong prisoner in the 68 Tet Offensive, nobody's ever seen pictures, because we've never been allowed to, of small landlords in South Vietnam being buried alive in front of their fellow villagers in order to discourage others from resisting the revolution, nor of the thousands of small landlords and so-called class enemies who were executed or murdered by the communists under Ho Chi Minh's regime. And I thought it was about time we balanced the account. It's not that I'm saying in my book that the Americans and the South Vietnamese were the heroes of the Vietnam War. There really weren't any heroes. I'm simply suggesting that the other side behaved pretty abominably too, and it's about time we saw things in a more balanced way. So that's one thing that very much was in my mind when I started writing the book. Secondly, there's all sorts of stuff that we didn't understand at the time. Everybody, including the President of the United States, believed that Moscow and Beijing, the Russians and the Chinese, were running this war, were pulling the strings on the North Vietnamese. Well, we now know it wasn't like that at all. That the North Vietnamese were leading the Russians, and in some degree the Chinese too, in a fashion we couldn't understand at all. But the Russians were giving $500 million a year of aid to the North Vietnamese, which they hated doing. The money was very important to them, but they felt they had to because they wanted to be the leaders of the socialist world. And when the United States started bombing the North my book, when Brezhnev, when he was running the Soviet Union, he growled to the Soviet ambassador in Washington. He said, "I do not wish to drown in the swamps of Vietnam." And he was desperate to get out of this thing. And he couldn't see how when he couldn't abandon the North Vietnamese. And all the time, right to the end, Nixon and Kissinger believed that all Moscow had to do was pick up the phone and the war would be over. And it wasn't like that. But the North Vietnamese were playing their own game. And they were giving the Russians and the Chinese almost as bad a time as they were giving the Americans. And we didn't understand any of this stuff back when we were reporting the war.
Would you say then, considering what you've said and what I've read about Vietnam, would you say that perhaps then if South Vietnam had better leadership, that perhaps they could have prevailed in this conflict?
I think there's a lot of truth in that. You can easily see a scenario. South Vietnam, from 1954 onwards, was no more and no less an independent state deserving of recognition and support than was South Korea or Taiwan. Mm-hmm. It was desperately unfortunate for the South Vietnamese that the leader whom the French and the Americans installed, President Diem, was a Catholic trying to run a Buddhist country and trying to favor the Catholic, who was incredibly incompetent, who had an exceptionally nasty brother who ran an absolutely horrible secret police force. And if Diem had run South Vietnam from 1954 onwards in a reasonably enlightened way, then yeah, you can see a scenario where they've managed to hold the Viet Cong, the local communist guerrillas, and where South Vietnam gradually turns into a democracy in the way that a lot of other Asian countries did in the latter part of the 20th century. And where you can imagine a scenario that you end up today with South Vietnam as a prosperous and successful democracy. But of course that didn't happen because Diem and the generals who followed him were incredibly incompetent. And I think the United States did make a huge mistake by effectively taking over the country in 64, 65, so that there's a South Vietnamese who is now a very successful businessman in California. He said to me, the other side had the monopoly of patriotism. He said the communists were always, from 64, 65 onwards, able to ram it home to us how humiliating it was to be occupied by the Americans. So yeah, it is possible to see a better scenario coming out of all this, but everybody managed to screw up along the line.
Mm-hmm. So, considering the French made a mistake in how they, in running or helping develop South Vietnam, the South Vietnamese didn't do a good job. The U.S. didn't do a good job. What do you think they were all forgetting or missing or not getting about South Vietnam that led to this?
First thing, although I think the people who say Ho Chi Minh was just a nationalist, he was never a real communist, I don't buy that at all. I think he was a very ruthless communist revolutionary. But on the other hand, Ho Chi Minh, by defeating the French, he did secure a sort of monopoly position as the nationalist leader, that the South never acquired a leader who could match Ho Chi Minh's prestige as the victor over the French. And a lot of the people whom President Diem put in to run things in the South after he took over in 54 were people who'd worked for the French. They hadn't taken any part in the independence struggle. And that was a hell of a handicap. But I mean, the initial craziness was that the French in 1945, having been kicked out of Vietnam by the Japanese, when Vietnam was we won't say liberated, but when the Japanese were kicked out in 45, that it was insane for the French to imagine that they could hold on to the country, they could hold on to their empire. But the trouble was the French had been so humiliated in World War II that they were absolutely obsessed at the end of the war by wanting to recover la gloire, the glory, la patrie, to reassert their greatness in the world. And we, the British, were very lucky because our electorate put in a Labour government in 45 that got us out of India and Burma very quickly, whereas the French fought this terrible 10-year war. And it was, they called it La Sale Guerre, the dirty war, culminating in this disaster at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. And what was sort of crazy about it, all the way along, everybody else could see that this was absolutely crazy. But unfortunately, in the early 1950s, President Eisenhower, of course by then everybody was very much preoccupied with the Cold War, the French were successful in convincing the Americans that the colonial cause was also the anti-communist cause. Mm. So by about 1952 onwards, if the French are fighting wearing American helmets, driving American jeeps, with flying American aircraft, using American weapons, it's not too surprising that when the American troops came along 10 years later, that the Vietnamese thought, oh, well, this is all the sons of the colonial. Mm. And the degree to which the Americans let themselves be convinced that it was part of the Cold War to see off the Viet Minh, as they were then called, the predecessors of the Viet Cong. That was crazy. I'm afraid that the French should have just been left to lose it in a way that the British had to get out of their colonies.
Mm-hmm. So let me turn more specifically to the book. I must say it's a very readable narrative, and it's amazing in its scope. You know, it's both political and military history combined. From the
that's really nice of you to say so, Chris.
It's and you know you have tactical parts that look at tactical level, operational, strategic. You know, you have personal remembrances, so it goes from a ground level to, you know, a 30,000 foot level, and it flows so nicely, you know, throughout. And I think it's quite an accomplishment. So I wanted to ask, how did you choose, with all this subject matter and the 30 years you cover, how did you choose what to focus on throughout as it went along?
Well, you choose it's above all what I've learned, because I've been writing books about wars now for 30, 40 years. And one of the things, when I started out, I used to think that wars are mostly about soldiers and about generals and so on. Well, of course they play a part in it, but above all, the story one's trying to tell is about people, and that includes women, and that includes victims, and you just try and talk to the widest range of people you can. And one thing I found fascinating in writing this book was that when I started out, which is 3 years ago, and I thought, well, I'm getting old a bit now, and can I face doing all the research myself, traveling around the United States and Vietnam? And I thought of sending some young researcher to do the interviews for me. And then I thought, no, I figured I've got to do it myself, because I knew that the advantage I had, because I'm more or less the same age as the veterans, and I'd been there myself, and even though I was very young and stupid, and I knew the places, and I knew what Vietnam looked like, and so on. So I did it myself, and I did find it pretty tough, because I said, in case you haven't noticed, your country is enormous, and driving around it in an Avis car. I mean, there were moments when I was sort of driving around in the middle of the night in South Carolina in an Avis car in a thunderstorm, looking for sunbays. You sometimes think I'm getting too old for this. But the stories are fabulous, because you sit and you talk to people about their lives. It's really social history. And I haven't traveled around the United States this much since I lived here in 67, 68. And if you come as I do from the sort of English middle class, you get to meet a range of Americans and a range of Vietnamese, of the sort of people who've had experiences that I can hardly think of. I mean, I remember one guy in particular I liked a lot, who came from a coal mining community in Appalachia, and he was describing to me growing up in this little town in the late 50s and early 60s. And he said on Saturday nights, he said, well, all the men did was get drunk and beat up their wives, including my mother. And that's the sort of world that is sort of out of my range. And I was talking to an enchanting former U.S. Air Force navigator called Norm McDaniel, who'd been a prisoner in Hanoi for a long time. And he was describing when he was a commissioned officer of the USAF in the early 60s on a airbase in Oklahoma. He said he loved the U.S. Air Force and they treated him very well. But the moment he and his wife left the base, no restaurant, no hotel would happen. And I said, I think the hardest part for me in putting the book together, the original draft, was about twice the length of what we published, because I've so much been in love with all these people's stories and all their accounts. I mean, there was one story in particular that moved me deeply that I came across in the fabulous U.S. Army archive up at Carlisle, the U.S. Army Heritage Center, which is an absolute treasure trove of oral history narrative. And I was reading about a Texan nurse called Shirley Purcell, who was called to active duty in 1966. And she said, I really didn't have a political commitment. She said, but the American troops there who needed help. And her descriptions, she described, I think, one of the most moving accounts that I put in the book. She was describing the utter misery and frustration when she said a young man was brought in who had trodden on a bouncing Betty mine, and the whole of his middle, she used the phrase, had just been reduced to hamburger meat. But his legs were still there, and the top part was still there, and his mind was still there. And she said the frustration that went through that unit, seeing this young man lying there, still conscious, still talking, when they could do absolutely nothing for him. And she described how he said to her, how does it look? And she said, it doesn't look good, but you won't be alone. And she said the only thing that we had to offer him in that unit, we could do nothing for him medically, but all we could do is just see that he wasn't alone as he died. And she said she'd been a teetotaler all her life, but in the officer's club at Tulite, she started on screwdrivers, and who could blame her? And she said she could never bring herself afterwards to watch MASH on TV because her memories just made it impossible to laugh at that sort of stuff. Yeah. And you get, if you're like, I mean, this is what I do for a living. This is listening to these stories and reading these stories and so on. And you get so completely hooked because this book, it's not really military history, it's social history. You're just learning stuff about people that if I stayed at home, I wouldn't have any clue about.
So you said it's a social history, but is there a theme or say a main focus you're going for?
Yeah, and I think there are two or three, I think, very important lessons for the 21st century. A lot of stuff that happened in Vietnam has happened since, although on a much smaller scale, in Afghanistan and Iraq. And for me, the big lesson, I am no pacifist. I strongly believe that one should be prepared to use armed force in defense of one's national interest. But in these interventions in relatively primitive societies, one has to recognize that the military bit means nothing unless you can establish some cultural and social link with the society that you're getting into. And if nobody speaks the language and nobody takes any notice of the people, and to put it bluntly, if they tend to treat all the people like shit, you can't expect that you can win all the firefights you like, and it doesn't mean a thing. And I was terribly struck. An American officer I admire enormously, H.R. McMaster, whom I know pretty well. Around about 2006, I was having lunch with him in London, and he was talking about what his armoured cavalry regiment had done in Iraq, and their battles and their victories, and they were victories. But he said the problem was there was nothing to join up to. Now, this to me is absolutely vital. That the point is, you can go on killing bad guys till the cows come home. Unless there's some local government, local society to join up to, it's worth nothing. And I ran into HR again in Afghanistan, and I said, it's still the same problem, HR, but there's still nothing to join up to. And it was the same in Vietnam. But I can imagine a scenario where when the North Vietnamese regular divisions took over fighting the war from 69 onwards, that if you can't imagine the United States Army having defeated them. But to what end? When the government in Saigon was still so unpopular, and it had no support from the people at all, really, and the South Vietnamese army, and who can blame them, were apt to be worn out with the struggle. And I think that if we want to make a success of any of these future interventions, we've got to be able to engage successfully with the people, and then regard the military bit as only a part of it. And I still think we're not getting that right. And I was another American I admire enormously, Walt Boomer, who helped me a lot with the book, Marine General now. In fact, he's retired Deputy Commandant of the Marine Corps. And I was so struck, and I've used it as the last words in my book. Walt Boomer, with whom I talked for a couple of days when I was writing the book, and he did 3 tours in Vietnam, and he looked back and he said, what was it all about? He said, it bothers me that we didn't learn the lessons. He said, if we had, we wouldn't have invaded Iraq. And in fact, when I got Walt to read the draft of my, I got several veterans to read drafts of my manuscript because try to cut out some of the mistakes. And when he read that, Walt said at first, he said, oh God, he said, my having said that is going to get me into trouble with some of my conservative friends. But then he very honestly, and I admired him for this, he said, no, I said it, and I thought it, so let it stand. And there's still a lot of lessons out of Vietnam that are still applicable to, for instance, air power. We still haven't learned the lesson that air power is terrific against, especially armored vehicles and troops moving in the open. At the moment you're dealing with dug-in troops, at the moment you're dealing with complex industrial installations, air power still can't do it all for you. And yet people still go on killing themselves, and especially governments, that air power can do the business and see off the bad guys for you.
So I have 2 questions about how the U.S. wages war, and you can use Vietnam as an example or others if you want. So first, how can the U.S. deal with external actors who are feeding, arms and resources to guerrillas who can just keep causing problems? And number 2, how do you get the American public to support a war where the U.S. hasn't been directly attacked, where it's more a strategic goal, perhaps, or a long range?
Well, one of the points I make in the last chapter of my book is that although I don't think in the 1960s it even occurred to the North Vietnamese to start doing terrorism in the United States, that in those days, in the sort of pre-globalism era, people didn't do that stuff. It was very smart of them if they had thought of it not to do it, because just supposing the communists had been conducting a terrorist campaign in the United States, Americans would have looked around and said, we can see what the enemy is, and why have we got to fight these people? But as it was, when no bombs were going off on Pennsylvania Avenue, and when nobody was getting killed in North Carolina, that there was no reason for Americans to see a direct threat. And George Ball, who was Undersecretary of the State Department in the Johnson administration, and he was the really smart guy who saw a lot of the problems coming up when the decision was made to escalate in 65. And George Ball said at a meeting with Lyndon Johnson, he said, Mr. President, if I saw us winning this war inside a year, he said, I would support it. And I believe we could carry the support of the American people. But he said, I do not believe we can win this war in a year. And he said, I believe the American people will get sick and tired of this. We can't sustain the will for this. And George Ball also said, which was obviously the Chiefs of Staff wouldn't agree with it, he said he didn't think that the U.S. Army was well suited to fighting that kind of campaign, guerrilla campaign, in the jungles and on the mountains of Vietnam. And he was dead right about that. That the other side were better at this stuff. And so it is a problem. I'm sometimes, the last job I did as a war correspondent, that I reported the British Falklands War in 1982. Now, the Falklands War in 1982 was tremendously popular with the British people because the enemy wasn't very good. The Argentine army was absolutely hopeless. And the war was over quite quickly, and we won. And it was all over in a few months. But in my opinion, if we got bogged down on the mountains in the Falklands, I think the British people would have turned sore on the Falklands War in the same way that the American people turned sore on Vietnam. Democracies are not patient, and we just have to accept that. And these days, it's not as unpopular fighting wars because you're fighting with volunteer armies, and also the scale of casualties is nothing like Vietnam. And I have to remember in 1968. The U.S. Army was losing 300 men dead a week, with U.S. forces, including the Marine Corps. 300 dead a week. 300 dead. Can you imagine the row there'd be about Iraq or Afghanistan if you were losing those sort of numbers now?
Right. Yeah.
And I was one of the things I learned. I always try in my books to write about the stuff people don't know about. And I came across a battle involving the Marine Corps called Dido in May '68, which does not even feature in most of the histories. And yet, this is the story of a 3-day battle just south of the DMZ in May '68, in which a Marine battalion was almost wiped out. That they lost 81 killed, and I forget how many wounded, I think about 250 wounded. And they ended the battle with one unwounded officer and about 150 men still left fit to fight. And can you imagine, I'm not aware of any action in Iraq or Afghanistan that's actually just strictly flat the whole unit. And yet this sort of stuff, Dido was only one among quite a string of battles in which that sort of stuff happened. And it got to, it was unbelievably tough, brutal, murderous war, and much more so than any of our recent conflicts.
So, just to stay within time, I'd like to turn towards the resources you used to do your research. You mentioned, of course, the interviews. What else, with all the material out there, what did you use, and perhaps what did you use that others haven't used as much when writing about Vietnam?
One of the things that I did a lot of the work in the Marine Corps Archive at Quantico and the U.S. Army Heritage Center. But I had a terrific break, but quite early on I was introduced to a wonderful guy, a former CIA officer called Merle Trivenhauer, who's a Vietnamese linguist who, ever since he came out of Saigon, same day as I did in 1975, he's devoted his whole life to translating Vietnamese memoirs and documents from both sides, communist and anti-communist. And I think without Merle, I couldn't have done the book, because he translated thousands of pages, and I mean literally thousands of pages of stuff for me. And it was absolutely fabulous. But for instance, when I was writing Dido about the battle, and I'd interviewed several survivors of Dido, and I got all the U.S. accounts, but then I was able to send emails to Merle in Washington and say, okay, here's what the Americans are saying happened to them on May the 1st, 1968 in Dido. What are the communist narratives? And Merle, I don't know when the hell he ever slept, because within a few hours he'd send me back extracts from the communist histories of the same battle. And most of their accounts were rubbish. Even today, you can't believe a word that you find in the Hanoi narrative. They're mostly Walt Disney stuff. But it's still interesting. It's just interesting to see what they said. And so one was able to use a breadth of communist sources that I don't think many previous histories of the war have done.
I can't imagine there was much in the way of North Vietnamese memoirs. I don't know if the country's opened up, in the last decade or so and allowed for that, or...
They don't. There's not. A lot of the memoirs, it is just pure propaganda. And again, you have to wade through acres and acres of nonsense to get to some absolute gems. But there are some, thanks to Merle, I did find some North Vietnamese accounts that were fabulous. And there's one great guy, which has been translated and is published in the United States, a communist North Vietnamese novelist called Bao Ninh, who wrote an absolutely wonderful, thinly fictionalized novel about his experience as a soldier. And he's completely honest. His account, there were a lot of unhappy people. They weren't. The most naive thing I heard said while I was researching the book, one day in Washington, I was talking to a very famous American correspondent who'd covered the war for ages. And he'd always been a warm sympathizer with the Northern cause. And I said to him, I wonder if they'd allowed peace demonstrations in Hanoi, how many people would have turned out? And he said, oh, none. They were all 100% behind the war. Well, I thought that was incredibly naive. And, in fact, when you read Bao Ninh's novel and some of the interviews I did in Vietnam, that there were just as many very, very unhappy young men in North Vietnam who absolutely hated to go to the war and were absolutely terrified from start to finish. And some of them, I mean, one guy described to me how he and a friend sat on the roof of the university building in Hanoi, talking for hours about how they might be able to fake medical conditions to get themselves out of having to go to the army. And this is just a sort of version of the war, a part of the war you just don't get from most of the accounts. And I would say there were quite as many North Vietnamese who hated the whole business and didn't want any part of it. There were young Americans.
So would you say, your book focuses more on the events in South Vietnam? How much do you talk about North Vietnam and stuff like what you just mentioned?
I've used a lot of stuff about North Vietnam. Again, nobody in the outside world knew what a terrible time they were having. From the day Ho Chi Minh took power in 1954, first of all, nobody wrote about the thousands of perfectly innocent people who were killed as class enemies or landlords or whatever by the new rulers. All this stuff about kind Dam was nonsense. He was a ruthless revolutionary. And also, for whatever the troubles of the people in the South, there was enough to eat. Whereas up north, they were starving. They were eating silkworm larvae and stewed rat with lemon leaves and this sort of thing. So I'm not being funny. Seriously, that's the sort of stuff. In the 1950s, there were long famine, and they were starving. And all they talked about, a lot of the people I interviewed up there for the book, they said, all they thought about was food, because they didn't have the energy to think about anything else. And there were several revolts, which were put down brutally, and nobody knows how many people were killed. But again, none of this stuff got reported in the West, because the communist policy of Omerta, of denying access to anybody except sort of Jane Fonda and so on, was incredibly successful. Speaking of that, there were sometimes you do have funny moments when you're researching this stuff. An absolutely wonderful man I interviewed for a book called Doug Ramsey, who was a terrific American. He was a foreign service officer who was devoted to Vietnam, spoke the language fluently. He was captured by the Vietnamese, by the communists, the Viet Cong, in January '66, and he spent 7 years in a bamboo cage in the jungle, in their house. And how he survived, God only knows. He had malaria 123 times, and every other known tropical disease. But he was a wonderful man, and he talked brilliantly to me about his experiences, and he gave me an unpublished, huge memoir of what happened to him. But he said there were two really funny moments in his 7 years. And one was, and this was the time when Jane Fonda's husband, Tom Hayden, who was a sort of well-known protester, was constantly up there visiting North Vietnam, telling him how wonderful they were. And one day Tom Hayden's name came up in conversation during one of Doug Ramsey's interrogations. And Ramsey said to one of these communist cadres, "What do you think of Tom Hayden?" To which the communist replied, he said, "We admire his ideology, but as a man we despise him. How could you betray your country like that?" And the other, to me, very funny moment was that he said at one point, he was interrogated again and again during his 7 years. On one occasion, he told them that he thought that the United States was in Vietnam 10% for the Vietnamese and 90% to try and hold back the Chinese and Mao Zedong. To which he said, his interrogators replied, "In that case, why do you not go and fight him in China? We do not like the Chinese either."
Yeah, that would be an interesting alliance. What would you say, what was the most enjoyable part of your research?
I think I love it. I still find, even though I'm now 72, but I get so completely hooked on people's stories. And you learn stuff. I've been doing this sort of book for a long time now. And you just have a privileged window into people's lives, way, way off my normal. And I love doing it. And you always learn stuff about people. And one of the things I hope I bring out in my book is that, of course, overall, the war was a disaster and a vast tragedy. But within that framework, a lot of people, Vietnamese and American, did some very fine and good stuff. And there was some Americans went to Vietnam with high ideals and an incredibly honest sense of purpose, a determination to do some good in the world. And one tries very hard to bring out what the good people and the Vietnamese good people. There were some communists that you have to admire enormously for their courage and their dedication and so on, even if you don't agree with where they're coming from. But all the time, what you're trying to do, I think if I ever try to do one thing in all the books I write, and especially this one, it's trying to say what this was like for people. And the guys at the sharp end, and you're always looking back, and you know, for instance, there was another wonderful guy whom I sort of fell in love with in Washington, or just he lives just outside Washington, a former corpsman, a medic called David Rogers. And he talked to me brilliantly about his experiences as a corpsman for the infantry unit north of Saigon. And I think it was 69 or 70. And it made a profound impression on me. I think his experiences influenced his whole life. And he said, because he lives close to D.C., he quite often goes to the Memorial Wall. He said he always goes very early in the morning at sort of 5 or 6 o'clock. He doesn't like to be there when there are other people there. And he says, I've got about 10 names, that there are 10 people in his unit who died. And, of course, because he as the corpsman was tending these guys when they were wounded or dying or dead, the emotional thing of seeing those names is still very big for him. And he says when he's there, he often thinks about, he said memories come back. He said, I did one thing, he said, one day I was up in Martha's Vineyard, and he said, I suddenly looked at a tree line, and I thought, that's like Vietnam. He said the prettiest things I saw there were helicopters, there were tree lines. And he also told me that in 1993 he went back to Vietnam as a guest of the government, as a reporter. And they took him up to the area where his unit had fought. And they introduced him to some former Viet Cong. And he said they bad-handed him, and he was terrifically fated, because all the Viet Cong were under instructions to be terribly nice to Americans, because they wanted Congress to pass a trade deal. And David Rogers said he found himself thinking, well, if all these guys wanted was a McDonald's, surely we could have worked this out a long time ago, which I must say is both funny and true, because, one of the really weird things, well, to me, and I've written about this in my last chapter, that although the United States lost the war militarily, that I personally believe today, looking at Saigon, I believe that in the long run of history, the United States won the war culturally and economically. Because although Vietnam is today governed by a very unpleasant totalitarian tyranny, that they are allowed to make money and they all want to be Americans. And I said in my last chapter that where the United States failed with B-52s and defoliants and spooky gunships, I think that YouTube and Johnny Depp have proved irresistible. That one of the lessons to me of the last century is that economic and cultural forces can be just as important in determining how things turn out as military ones. And I think this is one of the striking things that I think you can argue a very good case that the cultural and economic forces have almost reversed the outcome of 75. If you've gone back, if you'd said to an American officer back in, let's say, 1966, how would you like Saigon to look in 2018? Well, when you look up at the skyscraper, it's pretty much the way it does now.
Yeah. Huh. So how did you how did you get introduced to the people you interviewed? Did one interviewee pass you on to another, or?
You get passed around, and I had a wonderful interpreter, a young man up in Hanoi, and some Hanoi University people helped me along. And also within the exile community in California, one was sort of passed from one to another. And you just, it's sort of one thing leads to another, and it's I mentioned earlier Doug Ramsey. that I was down in California interviewing Vietnamese exiles when I heard that Doug Ramsey was still alive.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd always heard he was a fabulous guy. And I looked at the map. I found he lived up in Boulder City, Nevada. And I thought, can I face driving 300 and something miles in a baby's car to go and see him? And then I thought, yeah, let's go and try it. And it was a hell of a schlep across the desert.
Mm-hmm.
But when I got there, there's Doug, whose health was destroyed by his captivity.
Yeah.
So he couldn't move his body at all. But he talked brilliantly for 3 or 4 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And before I left, he said, you better take that with you. And that was a loose leaf folder of 500,000 words of a narrative he composed of his experiences in Vietnam, which is fabulous, and which I'm hoping someday to edit for publication in his memory, because he died actually in February this year.
Oh.
But it was sort of pure luck, because I nearly decided I couldn't face driving to Nevada. But God, I was so grateful that I did. And you just get passed on from one person to another, and you just meet incredible people, and it is such a privilege to hear their stories. And I've been doing it a long time. I mean, I've written a lot about the Second World War, and I think one thing one has to say: those of us who are lucky enough to live peaceful lives and not to have had to go to war.
Mm-hmm.
If I try to do one thing in all my books, you try and convey a message of how lucky we all are. In that, I always remember, and I will now tell a story which is not about Vietnam, but was about wars generally, that when I was researching a book maybe nearly 20 years ago over here, and I heard about a woman called Edith Gabor, who she had been in various death camps. She was a Hungarian Jewish woman who an American nurse had looked after in 1945 after the liberation of Germany. And this American nurse who lived over in Delaware, she told me about this woman. And I said, I wonder what happened to her. And she said, oh, she lives in New York, Queens. Well, I had my wife with me, and which I don't often on these trips, but she was up in New York. So we went together. I said, we'll go and see Edith Gabor in Queens on our way to catch a plane back to London.
Mm-hmm.
And we went to see her, and this wonderful, chunky little 80-something-year-old Hungarian Jewish woman talked to us for 3 or 4 hours about her experiences. Almost all her family had died in concentration camps. Mm-hmm. One brother survived. And we actually fell in love with her, and we adored listening to her dreadful experiences. And she was a lovely woman. And then afterwards, I called a cab to take us to Kennedy. And we went and stood on the sidewalk with the luggage. And the cab didn't come. And after about 20 minutes, I started jumping up and down. I said, if this cab doesn't come, we're going to miss the plane. And little Edith Gabor came and stood beside me, and I'm very tall. I'm 6'5", and she was about half my height. And she looked up at me, and she roared with laughter. And she said, relax. She said, it's not important. She said, it doesn't matter. She said, we have been in a death camp. You get to see that missing an airplane really doesn't count for much. And I felt so humble then, and the story's always stuck with me, because we are so privileged and so lucky to live safe lives today that one's respect and even sort of reverence for people who've been through such terrible experiences, and I was regarded as a privilege to have the opportunity to recount them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what did you find that was most surprising in your research?
Well, I think I talked about quite a lot of the stuff in the context of Vietnam. The fact that the Russians and the Chinese, although they were providing the weapons to the North Vietnamese, weren't happy and wanted out of Vietnam almost as badly as the United States wanted out. Mm-hmm. I think I didn't realize, even though I'd been there and I thought I knew a lot of history, I didn't realize the incredible scale of the intensity of some of the fighting and the casualties. I mean, the fact that in 1968 the United States was losing 300 dead a week, and they were, some units were almost getting decimated in battle after battle, and just the severity of those battles, the intensity of the casualties. And as I say, I think it refined all my thinking about the difficulties of dealing with insurgencies, that I'm convinced that you've got to see these things as primarily cultural and social problems with a military dimension. I would never put generals in overall charge of these things. You've got to have the generals to do the fighting. But generals' business is fighting. And so much of this stuff is about trying to help a society to function. But I don't think you can expect the military to sort out all the other stuff. I think you've got to have a lot of other people out there who can speak the language, who can and who can help to make the society function and realize it's not just all about killing bad guys.
So I'm curious about the North Vietnamese system, this police state that it had. Was it basically a Stalinist, Maoist kind of system, or did it have a Vietnamese flavor of tyranny to it? What we've seen in all communist societies, the one thing the communists are really good at is running police states. That I've said in my book that both North and South Vietnam became police states, but North Vietnam was a very efficient and ruthless police state, whereas South Vietnam was, you can say not nearly ruthless enough. Because there was the American press were operating down there, so all the terrible things that the communists that the South Vietnamese were doing got in the New York Times, and all the terrible things that North Vietnamese were doing did not get in the New York Times. Now, I'm not one of those who believe that, as some people did, that the media lost the war for the United States, but it is certainly true that it was fantastically difficult to, when you've got everything that went wrong down south, turning up on CBS Evening News, where nobody knew anything. Intelligence, the other thing the big thing I think is very important. You can't ever win these wars without good intelligence, and the standard of intelligence, both in Vietnam and even, dare I say it, to this day, is very poor. We are great. Not just the United States, but the NSA and the British GCHQ. We are fabulous at wireless interception. And if everybody starts using mobile phones and radios, we pick it all up. But a lot of these people, both in Vietnam and today, they don't do this stuff. And when you're getting into understanding Iraqi tribal relationships, we are still very poor at this. And unless you can get the intelligence right, you're never going to get anything else right. And a CIA officer who was in Vietnam, he told me that it was not until 1969 that the CIA was able to put together what they called a wiring diagram of the North Vietnamese leadership. For instance, everybody thought that Ho Chi Minh was still in charge until his death in 1969. But actually, from about 62 onwards, that Le Duan, who was an absolutely ruthless Robespierrean revolutionary who made Ho Chi Minh look like a teddy bear, that Le Duan was running the country, and no Western intelligence didn't know that, and almost nobody knew that until it's only now that everybody's got their minds around all this. Would you say, since the Vietnam War was considered the first, televised war, do you think that the U.S. military and the other militaries they partnered with didn't know how to handle it properly, manage that?
I think they've got better, but it is still a problem that communist societies still take very good care. You're not going to see people bleeding to death in their own blood among the Russians in Chechnya and all that sort of stuff. But totalitarian societies are still very ruthless in trying to conceal from their own peoples just how horrible war is. And the shock of Vietnam for everybody was you were actually seeing stuff that goes on in every war. In World War II, the newsreel footage of the horrible ways in which your own side died was never allowed to get into cinemas because it was thought it'd be too demoralizing. But suddenly in Vietnam, you see all this stuff. And one of the things I learned as a war correspondent, in all the old John Wayne movies, everybody, when they die, they just fall over and go, ah! But actually, people tend to die in unbelievably horrible ways. One of the things that had a big effect on me, I remember it was a day in about 1973 or 74 that I was driving in a Jeep north of Saigon. And I suddenly had to stop on the road because there was a group of South Vietnamese soldiers dragging across the road the bodies of some Viet Cong they killed during the night. And one of these guys they were dragging across the road through the dust was most of his guts had fallen out, and they were trailing about 8 feet behind him. And I suddenly had that feeling, looking at this body of this almost naked guy being dragged through the dust with his guts trailing along behind him. I thought if I was hit in the stomach, that's how I look too. And I'm bound to say it made me, it sort of, from that day to this, I've always, when I imagine being shot, an awful lot of us, we imagine that being shot, you just, the bullet goes in one end and you're just dead. Well, it's not like that. An awful lot of people, I'm afraid, die in the most horrible, horrible ways. And I got a lot more scared after, that memory lingered with me through other wars I went to, of that guy with his guts trailing behind him.
Would you say that of all the wars you did cover, and apart from the fact of the scale of Vietnam, would you say that's the one that most stuck with you?
I think it did have the Falklands War was sort of more, I don't know, the Falklands War was great for the British because it was something we did really well. But it was great to see the British armed forces doing something really well. And I say, the Falklands War flattered us because the Argentine army were hopeless. And I was lecturing a few years ago to Marine Corps officers at Quantico, and I had 300 or 400 young Marine officers. And I said, in the course of your long and I'm sure distinguished careers as warriors, if you are very, very lucky, you may meet an enemy as incompetent as the Argentine army, but unfortunately you probably won't. You probably have to deal with the Taliban or with other people who are rather tougher propositions. But yeah, Vietnam did make the biggest impression. I think partly because one learned never to be too impressed with your own firepower. I mean, one image from Vietnam, from my own experience, and I haven't written about myself at all in this book because I was just a very young and stupid observer. And this is not a book about journalists. I hate books about journalists. But, and this was 1971 when I was working at BBC, and I was up at Pleiku in the Central Highlands. And early one dawn, one of those fabulous, huge red Asian dawns, and I was standing out on the tarmac, and I was watching the helicopter crews stroll out to the helicopters and unlock the rotors and start up, and then one by one, about 50 helicopters, Hueys, Loaches, Chinooks, Cobras, all start up and roar away in that wonderful nose-down position into the dawn. And even though rationally, I knew at that moment that the United States, as most people in Vietnam did, had lost the war, when I saw that awesome display of power, I remember thinking so consciously, how can these mighty people possibly lose to a raggedy-ass bunch of guerrillas? And a lot of generals used to think like that. And the biggest mistake you can make in wars is to fall in love with your own firepower. You have to think beyond that. And even this day, sometimes when you see beautiful pictures of carrier groups and all the rest of it, and it's so easy to be seduced by thinking how smart and how strong your side is, and not to see that actually there are places and moments, and God knows Vietnam was one of them, where it didn't matter how mighty your side was, that you couldn't deploy that might effectively against this particular kind of enemy in probably the worst country for fighting a war you could possibly imagine.
Now, if I may ask, I have a fascination with the Troubles, and I saw one of the reports you had done about gangs there. Sorry,
the Troubles in where?
In Ireland.
Oh, yeah.
And I saw you had done a report on gangs there. I'm curious if you want to discuss this at all. Is there anything in Vietnam and in that situation that any kind of similarities or anything that someone could take and maybe compare and contrast?
The British have always thoroughly annoyed a lot of American soldiers because we have a habit. We did it in the 60s. Those who fought in Malaya against the communists went up to Vietnam and started telling the Americans, here's how we won in Malaya, now we'll tell you how to win in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
And in the same way, I know some American officers, if they weren't so polite, would let themselves get very cross with Brits who in Afghanistan and Iraq would start lecturing Americans on counterinsurgency about Ireland. Ireland was incredibly small potatoes by comparison with even with Iraq and Afghanistan. And yeah, there are tactical lessons that you can learn about how you do street fighting. I mean, for instance, a Marine officer whom I interviewed, Myron Harrington, who fought in Hawaii in '68 and won a Navy Cross there. And he said, there we found ourselves street fighting, and nobody had taught us how to do street fighting. And street fighting is a very specialized art. And nobody in Vietnam in 1968 thought they were going to find themselves doing street fighting, and then they had to retake Hue block by block in the spring of '68. So of course there are lessons that the British Army had to learn about street fighting and so on and so forth. And the British did get good at using special forces and snipers and so on and so forth. But for a start, there were terrific. The rules of engagement in Ireland were always very tight indeed. And although, sure, there were episodes, some of them discreditable, when the wrong people got killed. But again, the numbers were tiny compared with Vietnam. I mean, when things went wrong in Ireland, you might get 5 or 6 people killed. But when things went wrong in Vietnam, you've got hundreds of people killed. So I don't think there are comparisons. And generally, I think that the United States, especially now, it has at least as much experience as we do at fighting these kind of counterinsurgencies and these very difficult wars in Afghanistan and in Syria and in Iraq. But generally, I rather believe, I think we all try and listen to each other very carefully, but I don't think we try and tell each other that we know how it should be done. But I did a lot of reporting in Northern Ireland, and it was a very steep learning curve. That it was a war among the people, and wars among the people are very different from wars among national survival. And the first lesson is you have to avoid doing terrible things to the people. And of course, the essence, all the time in these insurgencies, the other side are trying to provoke big armies into committing atrocities against civilians that will turn the civilian population against the army. And obviously, Rule 1, which everybody thoroughly understands now, is that Rule 1 is never to let yourself get provoked by these people into disproportionate responses. But of course, in Vietnam, nobody got that message yet. So the United States dropped 4 million tons of bombs on South Vietnam, and it didn't work out too good.
What would you say was the most difficult for the book on Vietnam? What was the most difficult question for you to research? Was there an issue you really grappled with that?
Well, it's very difficult too. I mean, it's rather the same. I think one of the hardest things I ever had to do. I wrote a chapter in a book I did years ago about the dropping of the atomic bombs. I wrote a book about the Second World War in the Far East, and I wrote a chapter about the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and I found that a very difficult chapter to write, because I personally believe that I won't say it was a good idea, but I quite understand why they did it at the time. But the moral and political and strategic issues were so complicated that it really made me sweat to write it. In the same way with Vietnam. But all the time, you're trying terribly hard. I never believe that the issues, almost all big historical issues, are very muddy. They're very nuanced, and you're not dealing with good against evil, black over white. And you're trying to do justice to everybody. And if I have one thing I may hope to bring to the party as an Englishman, is that because I'm an outsider, although I've spent such a chunk of my life in the United States, one way or another, that one can hopefully try and look at this thing in a obviously for many Americans, looking back on Vietnam is still a great trauma. And I've tried to respect that trauma, but at the same time I've tried to look at this in as balanced a way as I can. And I say this, that although the war turned into a colossal tragedy, that I do understand why the United States got into it. And the motives for a lot of the people who went there were remarkably honourable and decent motives. And I think one has to recognise that in just the same way you have to recognise that, yeah, we know about the My Lai massacre. We know that the United States forces did some terrible things. But the other side did some pretty awful things too.
So you have written many books. You're well established. You wouldn't have had any trouble getting the book published, I assume.
Well, not at this stage of my career. At this stage, no, I'm lucky that I've had publishers for years, and they're kind enough to give me quite a lot of money to do these books. So I'm very grateful. But sometimes when I'm out signing books, and people say, "Oh, it's so nice of you to sign the books," I said, far from it. It's so nice of you to buy and read them, because without all you people out there buying the books and reading them, I couldn't do all this stuff, because actually it costs an enormous amount of money to do the sort of research I do on my book. And so you've got it's a business like any other. But what is great, when I started out writing books a long time ago, and I was going and doing interviews in Germany, and I was having to sleep in my hire car beside the Autobahn in Germany because I couldn't afford the hotel bills. Well, fortunately, we're past that now, but one still has to spend, it does mean that one is able to put a lot of capital into the books, which I hope pays off for readers, because you're able to travel to places and meet a lot of people that, in a way that when I started out you can't, and if you're a new author, you probably can't do either. So there are great advantages in having a sort of machine with you, and I've got a wonderful Russian translator who was able to do a lot of Russian interviews for me with Russians who were in air defense units in Vietnam, and I was able to get research done about the Chinese part, all the Chinese railway engineers and so on. And all that's only possible if you've got a machine out there, you know, that, and I say when you're starting out as a writer, you can't do that. Chris, it's been a huge pleasure and privilege to talk to you.
You too. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you. This podcast has been presented by WarScholar. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to visit warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com for more great interviews and military history information. Your visits help support this podcast. One of the best ways to provide feedback for this podcast is to rate me on iTunes. Please give me a good rating if you liked it, or feel free to give me a bad rating if you didn't. I'll use that feedback to make this a better podcast. You can also follow me on Instagram under Chris Alvarez WarScholar. That's Chris without an H, C-R-I-S. On Facebook under WarScholar, on YouTube under WarScholar 1945, and on Twitter under WarScholar. Thank you, and I hope you return to this podcast for more great military history.